Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another one of our masterclasses today. It's actually our last one for the year, but don't worry, there will be plenty more coming in the new year. So today's session, as you can see, is on remote working and is your governance remotely working well? As I am just allowing everybody to join, I'll just run through a few little bits and bobs. Firstly, just to explain that we'll start off with some introductions. I'll run through the house rules and then I'll hand you over to our host today. And then, as you said, as you can see there, we have Des Ward going to give his presentation first, and then we'll move on to Tate's presentation. And then we'll end on lots of hopefully interesting questions and give you a little bit more information on some events we've got coming up to end the year and into the new year as well. So also, I'd just like to say a really warm welcome to anyone who's joined us today who isn't yet a member of CIISec. As you can see, we are the Chartered Institute of Information Security. We did gain our charter status last year, which we're very proud of. And we do run a lot of other events as well. So along with the masterclasses that you're obviously here to see today, we do have our Associate Development Programme, which is our ADP. We do have our webinars that we're running with MPL as well. We had one yesterday, so if you want to catch up on that one, do go over to our website. And we also run our innovation webinars as well, which is something that we started new this year. So head over to our website if you want some more information. All of our events are on there, and a lot of them are available on catch up as well. And hopefully there's something there for you. We do also have our Pulse magazine, as well as different other accreditation routes. So yeah, any more information, please head over to our website for that. Just as I said, whilst we're waiting for people to join us, I'll just run through our house rules as well. So just a little bit of etiquette for the sessions we have here on Zoom. Just to let you know, you will be muted throughout the webinar, but don't worry, if you've got any good questions that you'd like to ask us, please do type those through using the Q&A facility. I think for you, it may be at the bottom of your screen. So please type any of those through to us and we'll be able to pick those up for at the end of the session. If you do have any issues today, hopefully you don't, but if you do have any technical problems, please do email us at support@ciisec.org and another member of our team will be able to pick that up for you and hopefully get you sorted and back in. Right, I think that's enough of me talking, and it's my pleasure to hand you over to our host for today, who is Craig Barber. Craig is our branch leader for our Thames Valley branch, and I'll hand over to you, Craig, to introduce the session a bit more.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's dark already outside as it is this time of year, but hopefully we've got some good talks for you this evening, and they'll be useful for you. So just to give you a bit of a background about myself, so I'm the Thames Valley branch chair. I took over at the start of the year, and we did hold an event in Slough at the company I work for, which is O2. Unfortunately, obviously things changed and everything has gone online since then. I'm hoping that as things hopefully get back to normal in the year to come, we can start to hold some more in-person events again and things, but obviously time will tell. We don't really know at the moment, but yeah, I took over at a bit of an interesting time. Give you a bit of background on myself. So I'm a security designer in network security, and I look after the e-commerce, online shop and the like, and also the enterprise and cloud services at O2. I've done quite a bit on national TV and radio, sort of when WannaCry was going on, providing advice to the public on sort of the cyber attack and what was happening and things like that. And I originally started out as an apprentice at BT, and since then sort of a bit of interesting stuff that I've done at with police vehicles. So I deployed some connectivity into police vehicles to do with automatic number plate recognition and things like that. And I've got a bit of a background in sort of incident response and vulnerability management and stuff as well. But at the moment, mainly on network security architecture and design. To give you a bit of an introduction for our two speakers tonight, so we've got Des Ward, who's been working in the information risk management industry for over 25 years. His background and sort of skill set ranges from sort of technical to non-technical, forensics, pen testing, risk assessments, and sort of for tonight, corporate governance. And he's going to be talking to us about governance around remote working. Tate Chakrabarti is Global Privacy Counsel at Reckitt Benckiser Group. He's a qualified lawyer with a decade's worth of experience in the field of data privacy and also the field of commercial law. Tonight he's going to be talking to us about international data transfers in 2021 and how this could potentially impact your business with moving data around the globe and across borders. So without further ado, let's start with Des Ward tonight. He's going to be presenting on Is Your Governance Remotely Working? And I'll hand over to you, Des.
Oh, thank you very much, Craig. We shall see if the technology shall actually work. Okay, so is this going to work? Okay, this is not working, as is always the case with these things. Oh, here we go. Can you see my screen, Craig?
Yes, I can. Yeah. Yep.
In terms of the PowerPoint screen rather than my screen, as we found out earlier on in the week.
Yeah, it's definitely the PowerPoint screen this time.
Perfect. Yeah. Excellent. So thank you very much. It's the one thing when you're actually giving a presentation remotely, usually it's a lot easier to gauge your audience, and I tend to pace, which is something you can't really do when you're sitting down. Anyway, so thank you very much for coming to this evening's webinar, and it's off the back really. The subject matter is off the back of an article I wrote just after we went into lockdown at the start of the year. And I was seeing an awful lot of organizations going through over a decade's worth of change, arguably within a matter of days, if not weeks. So the first question I have to ask you is, how did you react to COVID? And hopefully, Sophie, you'll be able to put up the poll for this. I can't see if you're doing it or not.
Of course, yeah, no problem. I'll put that up now for you.
Perfect, thank you. So, in the past, and I wear many hats in my work, but when I go and consult and help organizations out, I always used to ask them a question that will become more relevant as we go along in the actual presentation, but do you have a living management system or merely a compliant one? Now I ask, how did you react to COVID? And the reason for that is because the reaction and how useful your compliance regime was in guiding how COVID impacted your organization can tell me a lot about an organization's governance and how interconnected it is with its compliance. Are we able to see now, Sophie, what the results kind of are with that?
There we are. I've just shared the results there.
Perfect. So we've got an equal spread between both ends of the spectrum, really, which is pretty much where I'm actually, where I see people at. They either think that they were very, very good or not so great. So I'm going to see if I can, but I can take that out of the way now. So the reactions I typically see, either the board used compliance regime to actually guide their reaction. The board consulted with a security person. The compliance regime wasn't really up to snuff in terms of helping them work out how do we react to remote working. We'll come on to that later on in the presentation as well. But they still involved a security person to make sure that they weren't breaching compliance in terms of what they were doing, bearing in mind that a lot of organizations were reacting very rapidly to an ever-changing situation. And finally, the other end of the spectrum is that the board went ahead with how they were going to deal with it, then went to the security person afterwards to make sure that they were actually compliant. Now, what this actually means is, and the reality of life is governance in a lot of organizations are highly focused on the compliance regime, how compliant that management system is. And from my experience, it tends to be you create an awful lot of metadata to give to auditors when they actually come around on an annual basis. But if there's a disconnect between your management system, your governance, and the compliance regime, then quite often that information is merely there to create documentation rather than provide business value. So what is a compliant management system, and why actually is it not the best thing to actually do? Well, I think the first things first, we can have a look here at compliance and see, yep, compliance is about looking at your requirements, your laws, your regulations, your rules, and generating the policies and standards you need within your organization. But quite often, when organizations get it wrong, is the view is that the organization's actually passed the audit. Oh, well, it's fine now, we've passed that audit, we can just move on, or we don't want to change it because it's passed the audit. And therefore that means that everything's okay. The reality of life is the auditor is there and they're trained to look for best practice. They're there to look for conformance to the actual certification standard. They're not consultants, and indeed they can't audit their own work if they were to be consultants. So you have to understand what the audit's purpose is. Again, quite often the assets listed don't reflect the organisation. This is actually quite a key one because, I mean, asset management, it's never a perfect science, but you quite often see the impact ratings of assets where you get confidentiality and integrity being very, very similar, or across the board, you might actually see CIA in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability impact is actually very similar across the board, or you can have the same asset impact assessed 2 or 3 times. That shows that there's not really that much of an objectivity in that risk assessment, although to be fair, risk assessment in and of itself is not an exact science. The risk assessment itself actually is there to justify the controls rather than define what's needed. Anybody who's been through ISO 27001, sometimes you hear about people doing an ISO 27002 review. This is actually something that's quite important because once you understand the management system, and I actually discovered, I felt really old about 3 weeks ago when I came across a person who was 2 when I did my first BS 7799 audit. But the reality of life is ISO 27002 is guidance in terms of how you might implement Annex A controls within ISO 27001. The wording changes from shall to should. So it's really, really important that that risk assessment actually works out what it is you actually want to do, rather than merely justifying what you're currently doing. The controls themselves in a merely compliant management system quite often are not amended because they might not pass the audit the next time. Well, this policy, it passed the audit, therefore we don't want to change it. It has to be something where you actually get people actually working with you. And this is where the business has to be involved in the creation of the controls, both in terms of the technologies and the processes being implemented. If you don't involve the business and explain why these things have been done and that they can feel that they can come and talk to you, then not because of the insider fit, it's a term I really dislike. Most people and most breaches happen because people just want to do their job right, or they've not been trained properly. So it's really important to explain the importance of the actual technologies and procedural controls actually being implemented. And the final thing that I tend to see quite often is template policies being used. And you get a consultant in, they'll give you a management system in the box, they'll get you through the other side. But then what will actually happen is that when you sit down with the organization, and I've done this in terms of supply chain reviews, you sit down with an organization, you ask them, well, why is that access control policy like that? Well, because the consultant told us that's how we need it to do. Do you do that? No. So it's really important to get that engagement here. And why does this actually matter? Well, it's interesting because what we do in the common framework, we look at all of the laws going back to the 1800s. It's been a lot easier over the last couple of years with more detail coming out. But when you're looking at the cyber security breaches survey from the DCMS, year on year, cybersecurity is always a board priority. For this year's one, 80%. But when you actually look at what they're actually doing in terms of the respondents, that's 80% of organizations say, we really care about this. Yet a third are doing cybersecurity risk assessments. about 40% by and large have cybersecurity policies. 12% actually have 100% coverage with the baseline of cybersecurity standards within the UK. Only 15% of organisations have reviewed their supply chain risks. And that's actually more interesting, but with the 24% of organisations who stated that cybersecurity was their very highest priority, only 14% reviewed their supply chain risks. There is a real disconnect between intent and action. And more importantly, right at the end is, and more relevantly, not only to this topic, but because of the change agent of COVID, only a quarter of organisations had remote working policies. So the reality of life is risk is understated in all companies. And when I say that, there's intuitive risk where organisations make risk decisions every single day. Are we going to do this? Are we going to do that? And they make a decision on the balance of things. But risk in terms of information security, cyber risk, whatever term we're actually using for it, it's a black art. And in some ways, sometimes I do wonder if some of the respondents to this score low because they don't really understand that cyber risk is information risk, is information security, etc., things that haven't really changed. Things are getting more complex, and there's an awful lot of duplication. The NCSC has been very, very good at providing detailed guidance over the last 2 or 3 years, but there is also, through our own analysis, a lot of duplication. And that regulatory burden is something that could actually be managed better, which means that the risks are actually becoming more complex to actually understand and actually measure. The basis for cybersecurity and data protection aren't widely adopted. Going back to the same study, less than 2% of all organisations stated that they actually checked the basics from the NCSC and the ICO in terms of what they needed to do for cybersecurity and data protection. But it's not only that penalties are on the increase, but penalties and awareness in and of themselves are not enough to change the culture. And as I keep saying to my clients over the past year, the first fine underneath the applied GDPR was actually because of soggy boxes in a courtyard. It wasn't the funky, complex, in inverted commas, cyber attack. Governance and information governance is really important. And tech solutions themselves are actually being used without governance and without that context in terms of, well, why are we actually doing this? And this is important because remote working itself has taken staff beyond the firewall. The firewall itself is no longer the bastion it once was. When I was looking for the images to use for this presentation, I really struggled, but then we go back to that bastion. And actually, this bastion up at the top left, it's something that actually hasn't existed since 2003, arguably, once we started punching holes through because of e-commerce. I mean, and I've been a firewall engineer in the past. I mean, as Craig said, I come from that technical background. And the reality of life is people are now working at home. So you can no longer rely on the central services that you have. But it's really important as well that those risks, that when you're managing them, that they're not just being managed by using jargon as a service, that you're actually understanding what the controls are actually intending to do, and to make sure that your control outcome itself is actually clearly defined so that you can measure it. So how do you evolve to a living management system? First things first, identify those assets that you're trying to manage. Look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Actually start off with the availability and the integrity aspects. The reason why I say that is because people want access to their systems. That's your availability. It's another way of talking about it. Integrity in the English language, though, actually causes a lot of confusion in this industry because people see integrity like being the integrity of a ship's hull. Whereas when you look at the definition of integrity, it's impact from unauthorized changes or modification. So if you actually go to your business and you say, okay, how accurate is this information? How much do you rely upon it? How much impact would there be to you if it was changed without you knowing? You then create a data set that has value to them. I've worked in many different sectors where I've seen in energy, people being able to bring down energy trades down from 5 days to 1 working day, just by being able to trust the information and not having to go back to change it. If you sort out your integrity and availability aspects, then then the data and the information becomes valuable, and people don't want people mucking about with it. Integrate that risk assessment into your corporate governance. Try to use the same risk language wherever possible, and certainly at the very least, use comparable risk tiering. Work out that control outcome and make sure that you can understand and measure if it's being met. Consult on those controls and the processes within the business. It's really, really important to actually sit down with the business and say, okay, this is what we want to try. Is this actually the right thing to do? Because once you've actually got to that stage, then you get more buy-in for what it is you're actually trying to achieve. You actually get a bit more adherence to what you're doing. It's very, very similar to COVID. If you actually explain the benefits and the boundaries of what it is you're actually trying to achieve, then the business will actually buy into it much more. But also have your processes there to capture when the controls aren't working. As I said before, well, we're past the audit, therefore we can't change anything. Far too often I see management systems where people, through the best of intents, try to achieve perfection, and that's impossible. There is no way to deliver total security. And arguably, the last secure system I saw was NT for 3C or C, I think it was 3C, which was an air gap system. It had no connection to a network. You have to have some risk within there. So it's making sure that you have that feedback loop, either when the controls aren't working or when they're not working for the business and the business feels that they can come to you and have that discussion with you. Make sure that you've got that process of continual improvement. It's much better to get to where you need to be rather than to where you want to be. And all that doing the latter, and everybody wants to do the best they can, but if you don't have the resources to do it, if you don't actually have the budget, the people, the time to actually go and deliver all of these things, then when it comes back to that certification audit, you're simply going to be failing all the time. So it's much better to dial back, especially post-COVID, actually get back to your basics, bring your basics up. I mean, as I said, we've got a very low adherence according to the respondents to the DCMS survey. That's possibly, and more than likely really, because people want to do the best they can, but bring it back. It's much better to do that. So we've talked about the actual where you need to get to, and that's wonderful. That's going to take time. So what should you actually consider now? Now, anybody who's read any of my articles will actually see this for the last 2 or 3 years now, really. Go back and assess the endpoints and the remote working solutions that you have against the basics, your GDPR 12 steps and your NCSE 10 steps guidance. That will give you 30 areas to look at. The reason why I say 30, it's not because of a poor Scottish education system, it's because there are actually 18 areas when you look and analyse the NCSE 10 steps guidance. So there's 30 areas there that you can actually look at from the back. And actually by looking at that, it means that you've got a better baseline to look at your own supply chain, to look at all of your organisation departments, whatever. Get back to basics after COVID. Actually make sure that the way that you're working now, you've got a justification that you can get better on. If you're not able to use your information security management system or your business continuity management system to guide you during your reaction to COVID, work out why. Work out the actions. Work out the plan to address those gaps. Again, we live in very, very difficult times. You might not be able to fully address the gaps, but make sure that you understand as an organization what the steps you want to do and that you can justify not only your actions, but your prioritization and your timescales. Identify the company data that you're actually uploading to the cloud. The cloud has been incredibly useful in the reaction to the pandemic. And actually, I think anybody who's been using Teams before this year will have seen that Zoom has pushed it hard. There's been a massive transformation in the utility of remote working and cloud services. But this tsunami event that's displaced your entire workforce and your company data, you now need to start to make your way back to where you want to be. And that means understanding the data that you have, making sure that you understand the format, the location, and how you can actually get it back. Because this is really important. If you don't know where it is and you don't know its location, and this is going to become important as we exit this year and into a new interaction with cloud services, which are predominantly based in Ireland, it's really important to understand these things. Assess if you need to make your changes to your security policies, not only because of failures that you've identified, but talk to your staff. What worked for them? What is simply undoable for them? As security professionals and as an industry, we are very good at being Puritanian. But what we actually need to do is we need to be more engaging, work out what changes we need to make to our controls. And finally, review what control you have over the data on your personal devices. Because if people have worked from home and have had to use their own devices, they're not going to be best pleased if all of a sudden your entire BYOD strategy was you own the entire device and you can wipe it whenever you want if somebody's got their photos on it. So have a look and do that audit in terms of the data that's on the personal devices. Can you actually get it in containerization and how much control you can have over it? But not only that, engage your legal counsel, engage your HR in terms of, have you got that policy right? Is it actually realistic? So I do hope that single days isn't quite like triple days and you were able to get through a North Scotland vocal encryption engine. But now I'm going to go and hand over to Tate, who's arguably the main event, and I hope that you enjoy him.
Thank you, Des. Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. Yeah, we can hear you.
Anyway. Yeah, I'll just activate this so we can start. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's very good of you, and I hope that I can add value to proceedings. My presentation today is International Data Transfers in 2021. By way of background, my role is Global Privacy Counsel at Reckitt Benckiser Group plc. My role involves, on a day-to-day basis, data privacy matters in connection with the global operations of Reckitt, and it keeps me extremely busy. Let's just put it that way, especially in today's world. Just a bit about RB. The best thing to do is just to list, well, as you can see here are a few of our well-known brands, and I'll just let you all have a quick look through before we crack on. There's a lot to get through. Okay, excuse me, slight cough. Now this topic, I must say that it's quite a dry topic. I mean, I get asked to present fairly often these days on matters associated with privacy, and data privacy impacts upon almost all aspects of an organisation, and indeed many aspects of our lives. But this is a more difficult topic to talk about purely because it's dry. It's extremely legal and it's dry, but let's go through what we need to go through. And then if you've got questions at the end, I shall of course try and answer them. And if I can't answer them as of today, I will try and get back to you at some point. So starting with a bit of background to this presentation, July 2020 onwards has seen several major developments in the world of European data privacy. The first of these was on the 16th of July 2020, where the Court of Justice of the European Union issued its judgment in the Data Protection Commissioner versus Facebook Ireland and Maximilian Schrems case, or as it's more commonly known, Schrems 2. On the 11th of November, just a few weeks ago, the European Data Protection Board, or the EDPB, as it's more easily referred to, issued recommendations by way of 2 documents on measures that supplement transfer tools to ensure compliance with the EU level of protection of personal data. Almost simultaneously, the day after that, on the 12th of November, the EU Commission released new standard contractual clauses in draft and that was on the 12th of November. Now, collectively, these changes in connection with Schrems 2, the EDPB recommendations and the new standard contractual clauses will impact the steps an organisation undertaking international transfers of personal data will need to consider and to ensure compliance with European privacy law. And these are also considerations that UK businesses and their international partners will need to take in order to prepare for the end of the Brexit withdrawal period on the 31st of December 2020. Now, I'm speaking from personal experience. It's jumping slides. I'm speaking from personal experience here in connection with my organisation when I say that Reckitt, we are considering each of these issues in turn, and we are having to assess how such changes will impact our global operations. So after talking about Schrems 2, the EDPB guidance and the SCCs, I'm going to talk a bit about how your organisation may be affected, and also Brexit, which is something which is foremost upon everyone's mind at the moment. So let's start with Schrems 2. Excuse me. So as mentioned, the decision took place on the 16th of July 2020. Note that prior to Schrems 2, the EU-US Privacy Shield and standard contractual clauses were the two key appropriate safeguard mechanisms used to transfer personal data outside the European Economic Area to non-adequate countries, also called third countries. Now, in Schrems 2, the Court of Justice invalidated the EU-US Privacy Shield programme, and they mentioned that they would possibly need additional supplementary protections to be implemented when standard contractual clauses are going to be used to ensure an essentially equivalent level of data protection. The Court of Justice also ruled that data exporters looking to rely on SCCs must perform an assessment of the circumstances of the transfer and the recipient country's legal order to confirm that the personal data that is transferred is granted a level of protection that's essentially equivalent to the EU's protection level that's guaranteed in principle under, firstly, the GDPR and also the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. If the assessment shows that this level of protection is not afforded, i.e. if the law or practice of the third country impinge on the effectiveness of the SCCs, additional supplementary measures must be implemented with the aim of achieving a sufficient level of protection. And if such additional measures are not able to safeguard to a level of essential equivalence for data protection, it is recommended that the transfer is suspended. The next topic to talk about are the guidelines issued by the EDPB. So I've mentioned before that they released these on the 11th of November. And just by way of background, the EDPB is tasked with overseeing compliance with data protection laws, and its guidance, in essence, it describes how data controllers and data processors transferring personal data outside the European Economic Area may comply with the Schrems 2 ruling. Now, these recommendations are applicable immediately, but they were open for public consultation until the 30th of November, so that was just a few weeks ago. The recommendations essentially comprise two documents. First of these is 01/2020, known as the supplementary measures, and these cover the assessment and supplementary measures that data exporters may need to adopt to ensure compliance. So my slides keep jumping. They may need to adopt to ensure compliance with the EU level of protection of personal data. And the second part of it, 02/2020, are known as the European Essential Guarantees for Surveillance Measures, also known as the EEG recommendations. And these essentially lay down the elements to be used to examine whether surveillance measures allowing access to personal data by public authorities in a third country can be regarded as a justifiable interference with the level of data protection guaranteed in principle by the EU. Now, how these two sets, apologies. Apologies, we are having problems with the slides. So as I was saying, so how these two sets of recommendations come together and provide guidance is that 01/02, They provide a step-by-step guide to help data exporters assess a third country's legal order and identify appropriate measures. And the EEG recommendations, they fold into this process when assessing the third country's legal order. Now, key takeaways of the recommendations are summarised quite well by the EDPB in 6 steps. The first of these is a mapping exercise where data exporters are advised to know their transfers and should have a clear overview of all their personal data transfers, and in particular, the recipient country. Data exporters should be able to rely in large part on their Article 30 data processing records to build their transfer inventories. So in practical terms, this would be the use of the data mapping exercise that most of you will have conducted prior to the implementation of the GDPR. The second step is the verification of transfer mechanisms. So for each personal data transfer, data exporters must identify firstly whether the recipient country has been granted an adequacy decision, and if not, as is the case with the UK at the moment, which appropriate GDPR Article 46 safeguards are going to be used. And by these, we mean standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, and Article 49 derogations. But for the purposes of this, for most of us, it will always be standard contractual clauses. Step 3 is an assessment of the third country's legal regimes. Now, if the data exporter is going to rely upon appropriate safeguards, it must assess to what extent the law or practice of the third country may impinge on the effectiveness of the appropriate safeguards in the context of the transfer. And the assessment should be focused on the legislation, or if that is not available, other relevant factors relevant to the transfer and appropriate safeguards that may undermine the level of protection. Step 4. Now, this is only necessary if the above assessments do reveal that the third country impinges on the effectiveness of the Article 46 transfer tool, and take that to be standard contractual clauses. If this is the case, the EDPB has provided a non-exhaustive list of examples which you can use to consider this further. And this includes things like technical measures, contractual measures, and organisational measures. The EDPB also emphasises that the data exporter and importer bear the responsibility for ensuring that the measures are effective, and this may mean that several measures will need to be combined, or that no measure can ensure an essentially equivalent level of data protection. The 5th step is the implementation of appropriate safeguards, and so in simple terms that the data exporter and importer comply with all formalities and they put in place appropriate safeguards. Again, this is likely to be standard contractual clauses in the future. And the 6th step is the re-evaluation at appropriate intervals of the measures used. So bear in mind that data exporters should also monitor the legal developments that are applicable over time to their personal data transfers, as well as those in the third country's legal regime. And this also applies to adequacy decisions, as these can be re-evaluated by the EU Commission from time to time. Excuse me. Moving on to the next topic, standard contractual clauses themselves. So, as I mentioned, on the 12th of November, new standard contractual clauses were issued by the European Commission. By way of background, standard contractual clauses are the universally accepted method of international data transfers at present. And for those of you who are not aware, they are at their simplest level agreed contractual terms that set out a framework for the transfer and processing of personal data. The advantage of using these when negotiating commercial contracts is that when they are in a standard agreed form, they are easy to execute. And the last version created was in 2010. I think the first version was created in 2001. And the way most people use them is that they are essentially executed and inserted into data processing agreements or data sharing agreements. Now, several changes have been proposed for the new standard contractual clauses, and I shall talk about each of these in turn because I do feel that they may be relevant for your organisations. There's quite a few more, but I picked 7 in particular, which I do feel we should, that I should just make you aware of. Now, the first of these are the organisations that intend to rely on standard contractual clauses or have them in place. They will benefit from a transition period of 1 year from the introduction of the new SCCs to adopt the new format and revise existing contracts. Please note that this grace period will end if the contract is revised within that year. Just a quick note, I've been asked quite a few times in the last few weeks about if there's a grace period for the EDPB supplementary measures that we were talking about a few moments ago. And just to clarify, the EDPB supplementary measures are not subject to this or any other grace period. The second point that I'd like to discuss, and this is quite an important one, is that the standard contractual clauses that have been approved in the past in 2001 and 2010 only address two data flow scenarios, that of an EU-based data controller exporting data outside of the EU to either other data controllers or to data processors. Now, in this new draft, the Commission, they depart from that approach and they address gaps which frequently occur in practice. They allow now for EU data processors to serve as data exporters to controllers and processors outside of the EU. And there are 4 scenarios that are catered for. And these are laid out in a series of modules with applicable clauses included prior to and after the more specific sections. The 4 scenarios are controller to controller transfers, controller to processor transfers, processor to processor transfers, and processor to controller transfers. The third point to make is that the new SCCs don't require the data exporter to be established in the European Economic Area. The advantage of this is that non-European Economic Area entities can also sign the SCCs as data exporters. This provides a very elegant solution to the previous gap for non-European economic controllers and processors who transfer EEA data to non-EEA third parties on a regular basis. And this is a scenario that arises on an almost daily basis for many organizations. I speak from personal experience when I say that I see this often, and I'm sure this applies to many in the audience here today. The fourth point is about flexibility for EU-based processors. Now, flexibility is enabled now for those EU-based processors who frequently export personal data to non-EU sub-processors who don't currently have a satisfactory legal mechanism to cover those transfers. In my opinion, this now reflects the expanded scope of the GDPR in that it is and has become the universally accepted gold standard for data protection globally, and it creates a pathway for controllers outside of the EU to work with data processors which are located in the EU on projects involving EU data. The fifth point is that the SCCs now include a warranty by the data exporter that it has used reasonable efforts to determine that the data importer is able to satisfy its obligations under these clauses. Point 6 is that data subjects should be able to invoke and, where necessary, enforce the standard contractual clauses as third-party beneficiaries. This, to my mind, legally raises 2 points. First of these is that the parties to the SCCs will need to choose a governing law that actually allows for third-party beneficiary rights. And the second point is that this may well lead to an increased number of third-party claims, especially after the COVID crisis passes and, as we expect, the world economy will weaken and worsen. The seventh point that I'd like to raise, and this is the final one, is this is quite an interesting one in that the new draft of the SCCs are explicit in that they will take precedence over other terms in the event of conflict. Now, contractually, this is something that I have always included for data processing agreements for my company, simply as good practice. And in future, I would recommend that any liability that's agreed for your data protection agreements should clearly include a breach of the SCCs if they are brought into play. Moving on, let's talk a bit about how all this affects your organisation. Well, the EDPB guidance is subject to a public consultation until the 30th of November 2020, and amendments may well be made to the text prior to them being formally adopted. Meanwhile, the consultation period for the draft SCCs for the standard contractual clauses, they will run until the 10th of December, which is tomorrow, after which point the SCCs will be finalised. The final SCCs, we anticipate they will be adopted in early 2021 or, perhaps in the first quarter of 2021. With regards to the UK, now, in a few weeks' time, we will be a third country under European law, and there's been no guidance yet as to whether the UK intends to adopt the new standard contractual clauses. There's been nothing from the government or from the ICO office. Even if the UK does adopt the new SCCs, it does seem likely that there will be a period of time in between the adoption of the new format. And so in practical terms, during post-Brexit UK, in the first few months of it, the old SCCs will still need to be used. And if anything, for the absence of anything else, that's the mechanism that most people are looking to use in the event of uncertainty in early January. So that would be my recommendation to you. Keep using them until the new drafts are applicable and available, and until the ICO or the government says, yes, we will use the SCCs, or until they provide a different method. The other thing to consider is also adequacy. It's possible that the UK could receive a finding of adequacy by the European Commission in the next few weeks or months, and this would remove the need for businesses based in the European Economic Area to put SCCs in place when transferring personal data to the UK. Finally, let's just talk a bit about Brexit. Now, the advice I would give to all of you is fairly high level, and just consider that as long as all the uncertainties that I've discussed remain, businesses involved in the transfers of personal data to and from the UK, I would recommend that they perform a careful balancing act in between compliance with the use of the new EDPB guidelines as and when they are finalised and the final draft of the SCCs, but also look to retain enough flexibility in your contracts and procedures if the status or the approach of the UK changes. We just don't know yet because there's been no formal guidance that's been forthcoming from the government or the ICO. Applied to the UK, and this is very much bearing Brexit in mind, the new SCCs do provide for scenarios where EU-based processors can transfer data to non-European Economic Area countries, including the UK. And this will be helpful for UK businesses using service providers in the EU. Let's see how that develops. In practice, I do feel that many businesses will still find it difficult to assess how competent or equivalent a government's laws are with regards to privacy. And indeed, our cousins in the EU may well face this issue with the UK itself until an adequacy decision is given. My advice to all of you would be wait until January, wait for the final drafts of advice from the EDPB and from the European Commission in connection with the new SCCs. Plan accordingly then. That's the approach we are taking. And I've held many discussions internally at different levels of Reckitt, just to sort of take this forward. That's the approach we are taking. Just wait a bit longer until January and see what happens. So that's the end of my presentation. We will move on to questions, but if you do have any questions offline, please feel free to drop me a line at any point and we can take it from there. So Sophie, if I hand over to you.
Hi, Tate. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. Thank you, Des, as well. I'm just going to pop on the screen now some of our upcoming events that we have. We're not finished with the year yet, but Craig, do you want to start asking the questions, and I can obviously pick up on those afterwards?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, if you by all means use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you have got any questions. There's a couple that came through for Mr. Ward. So there was one from Andy Jones. Do you feel some stakeholders can become a bit overwhelmed by the volume of overlapping advice? And Andy likens it sometimes to wanting to put his noise cancelling headphones on.
Yes, I mean, I talk about getting the basics right, getting the basics for both data protection and cyber security. And the one thing that I noted from the ICO specifically, and this isn't a criticism, they were all dealing with different things, is there was no pointing back to the GDPR 12 steps. There was appropriate security, yet we have the GDPR security outcomes, which most people, from my experience, who went through these large GDPR programs, which finished May 2018, will not have been aware of the specific cyber detail. So there is so much duplication, and this is the reason why I recommend getting back to basics after COVID. Have that sanity check. Make sure that what you're doing meets the requirements of not only the 12 steps guidance for data protection, but the 10 steps guidance for cyber. And this is actually really important because we talk about cyber essentials, whilst it's supposed to be based off of the 10 steps guidance, going back to the DCMS study. There were less people who were aware of cyber essentials than were aware of the NCSC 10 steps guidance. But there were more people who were compliant with the requirements of cyber essentials in the 10 steps, which shows that there's a disconnect between what cyber essentials is asking and the 10 steps guidance. I've worked long and hard with some government organisations over the past 2 or 3 months, getting away from the alphabet soup of different certifications, the commercial certifications, the cyber standards that's come out from the NCSC, and getting back to that. Look at your basics for data protection, look at your basics for cyber, and then build out. Because if we get back to that, actually, by getting that basics back in line, we're actually permeating that out throughout both the internal and external supply chains. You're going to get that benchmark, which is going to allow you, conversely, even though you're going back down, to go back up higher possibly than where you're at, because you've got a greater clarity on what it is you're trying to do.
Okay, thank you, Des. Hopefully, Andy, that answers your question. Had a couple more come through, and so this is an anonymous one. Another one for Des. Is now time the way to sort of move away from the traditional remote access method? So this person has said, well, governance around cloud, for example, software as a service, would surely be much easier to maintain and control because of it being location agnostic, i.e. it doesn't matter where the users are located.
Okay, first things first, it does matter where the users are located. I mean, Kate will attest to that as much as I will, because especially post-Brexit, where we don't know what the data protection regime is actually going to be. I mean, effectively, we appear to be in the holding pattern from the previous government regime, where they were saying, right, we're going to trust you, so therefore you're going to trust us, right? But we're still here waiting to hear back a response. So location doesn't actually matter, and there are certain laws in terms of the VAT Act where the primary source of data has to be resident within the UK. So the cloud forecast is somewhat cloudy, pardon the pun, but the reality of life is the governance surrounding it, and I've worked on global programs which have attempted to have a standard to rule them all. I've been involved in the Cloud Security Alliance. The biggest problem with cloud is that cloud is quite often misunderstood. So you're going to get some technologies such as CloudStack and OpenStack. I believe it's OpenStack, which is the one where you can get down to bit level, so you can get clarity over what's happened to your data and where it is. You've also got another virtualization technologies, which are seen to be in cloud. That's going to have better clarity over where your data is sitting. So when we're talking about remote access in and of itself, remote access into what? Because I've seen a lot with SASE and software-defined networking, where the boundary is changing, the network fabric is changing. We're seeing within the telecom security requirements, there's an awful lot of technical detail coming out of that, which will be delivered using the codes of practice next year. I'm involved at an industry level looking into that. So when we're actually looking at these things, cloud in and of itself is not a panacea. Using the cloud security principles will allow you to get a little bit of clarity over how that cloud service is working, but you can't take it at face value. The governance surrounding it, if you're talking to a pure play cloud provider, good luck with actually getting any kind of visibility over what they're doing. But not only that, getting them to change it.
Can I just add to that, Des? I mean, a slightly different point, but the question mentions no matter where the users are located, there's something else which we will have to consider in the future, and that's data localization. This isn't strictly something to do with data privacy, but certain jurisdictions, and mainly China and Russia, and to a certain extent Vietnam, they are moving towards a scenario where they want any and all data associated with their citizens to be stored on servers exclusively within their jurisdictions. If you think about the global scope of, well, certainly of China and Russia, it's huge. And for all multi-jurisdictional organizations, they represent a huge market for each of them. So these are considerations which we all need to think about. It is very tempting to just sort of say, the cloud provider, everything lies with them. But what we are finding is that we have to flag it again and again and again. And I get asked the question quite often now, do you want to implement any kind of formal wording associated with data localization whereby we force a vendor to bear this in mind? And at the moment, we aren't doing so, but I'm pretty sure in the future that more and more countries will take a more narrow view and adopt, well, if not practices as narrow as China and Russia, practices which veer towards their scope. So it's possible that, we will need to implement this contractually in future, but let's see what happens.
Perfect. Thank you, Des. Thank you, Tate. Another one for Des. Does the speaker believe that personal director level accountability for information security is required before board responsibility gets to the level required for the risks to be properly managed?
So it's interesting. There is a big misunderstanding about how company law works. I'm not a lawyer. I just happen to have read it. And officers of the organisation have a specific status within the law. Within the UK, it's no such thing as UK law. We've got Scots, English, Welsh, Northern Irish. But quite often, security is seen as being a techie thing. When we talk about these complex cyber breaches that's happened, they're not complex by and large. But there is already director level accountability as officers of the organisation for ensuring that there are certain behaviours actually being met. And that's often not well understood. Part of the reason why I am where I am today, when I was doing my Masters at Westminster before they stopped it, was that I did the law module. And actually I had to read the book because very long story short, my kids were born and I had to go and change things around. But because of that, and the relevance of that was, up until then, I could explain anything that was going wrong at a technical level very, very well. I was, as I said, I come from a pen testing background. I could hack into things. I was allowed to. I must stress. But the reality of life here is that when I was talking purely about the actual cyber threat, and it wasn't called cyber by then, it was 2007. Nobody really cared. Once I was able to quantify, well, actually, by not doing this, breach of this illegal obligation or whatever, the engagement with the board changed, and also the importance given to it by programs totally changed. So this personal, so getting director level accountability, they're certainly, first of all, the officers need to understand that they are accountable for any failures in management of information. But secondly, there definitely needs to be more engagement and more specific director level engagement with cyber. It would be nice to have them on the board, but unfortunately, I'm finding that, if I'm being blunt, our ability to communicate with the business properly. Risk is not as much of as an exact sense as what you might like to think. However, things are changing. We're seeing the Orange Book got soft launched last year with a set of assessment questions. The smart cyber professionals are not only going to engage with the business, but use that as a mechanism to assess corporate governance and get their risk basis back into it.
Thank you, Des. Yeah, I personally, I was quite surprised at the DCMS report that said that information security at board level was of interest was quite a high percentage, because I always had that age-old thing of, a lot of companies perhaps see security, as you say, as a technical thing, or perhaps as a tactical thing, rather than strategic, and certainly not at board level. But perhaps that is changing based on that survey and that report.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when you actually look at, I mean, I've got it on the screen, all of the entire thing, and you're seeing a recurrent theme. You've got 37% of the exec boards have a directive of cybersecurity responsibility. The same percentage carry out risk assessments, and 38 have policies. So we're seeing it's that core body of organisations who are thinking in a certain manner, but we still have 60%. Or slightly more than 60% of organisations that just see it's been a techie thing, go out and buy products, but don't actually understand what it is they're actually trying to deliver. And that's a real concern. And it's borne out year on year. If you look at, I mean, as we've done within the common framework, because we deal with cyber insurance, etc., to try to do some of the benchmarking, looking at the telemetry that's coming out specifically within the UK, because the US market is subtly different, it is concerning in terms of the level of engagement that they're getting.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Des. So one for Tate. Will the requirements for the SCCs alter the use of cloud services from the likes of Microsoft and AWS?
Put simply, yes, but all that's going to happen is that they will issue you with a new set of terms. As we all know, that when we contract with them, we have little to no bargaining power, so they will likely change their terms and tweak them accordingly. So yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess you don't have much control over that, as you were saying. Yeah. Another question, another anonymous one. Will a move to localized data storage requirements, I think this comes back off of what we were chatting about just now, for nationals impact the processing of personal data for financial institutions? So will a move to localized data storage requirements for nationals impact the processing of personal data for finance institutions?
I would argue not just for financial institutions, but for all institutions. I mean, if you have to sort of segment almost how you sort of siphon off and keep a certain, I mean, how should I put it to you? I mean, the issue we face on a daily basis is that anything to do with the data of employees in Russia or any consumers that we have in Russia, we need to sort of keep it on separate servers, and any vendor that we instruct that will process their data, we need to make sure that they understand this and they comply with this. My gut feeling is that certain vendors don't, but we do ask them these questions, and we stress that this is important. This is the law. With regards to China, we just handed over everything lock, stock and barrel to my counterparts over in China. There's like quite a large legal team over there. They are the experts with regards to Chinese law, but it's not just one type of institute or one industry as such. Everybody is going to be affected by this.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I see where you come from there. Yeah. Oh, go on, Des. Do you want to?
Yeah, and off the back of that, I mean, we're seeing more privacy regulation off the back of the applied GDPR. We're seeing the California Privacy Act, etc. But what's interesting as well, we're starting. I mean, when you look at the modelling within cyber risk, Lloyd's Lab, etc., when they're actually looking at the different things that might happen, and interestingly enough, they did pre-pandemic modelling last year, but they talked about the impact that localised laws were actually having. Part of the problem as well, I mean, and going back to a point made earlier on about cloud, is how do you know where it is? So we're talking about the processing of personal data, and this actually is going to be something that, dependent on what happens between the UK and EC/EU, could have an impact as well. Because, as I said, up until now, we've been quite happy having all of our cloud services over in Ireland. It's been lovely. Now we're going to start to move things into the UK. We're going to have organisations that, such as yours, which is part of a Spanish group. So you're going to have data held in different places, and how can you actually process that in accordance to the rules? And we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, as I said, there's been pronouncements made at a governmental level about what they would like to happen. and I've seen different opinions from different legal professionals. So I mean, I think I would actually ask Tate, I mean, Tate, do you think that what's the likely, well, so not what's going to happen with Brexit, that's kind of unfair, but what do you think is the likely impact even between Britain and the EU for this kind of thing?
All I can say is, I mean, I've been saying this to people inside my organisation and speaking with other legal counsel as well. All we can do is watch this space and see what happens. Is disappointing that the government hasn't sort of offered any further guidance as to this, because we are all affected by it. But at the same time, just watch this space. That's all I can say. I mean, you know, we can speculate upon lots of things, but until clear guidance is given, we are effectively shooting into the wind, and all we can do is watch this space.
Okay. Yeah, I guess Brexit aside, if everybody moves to like a localized model for storing data, things can get messy, can't they? Like you said, Des, transferring information to Spain back and forth, what you can transfer, when you can do it, and the controls around it. And yeah, it could soon get quite messy if everybody just holds their own data within their own borders, especially for multi companies, I guess.
And actually, part of the problem has been this continued discussion about data rather than information. The reason why I talk about information as much as possible is because it has a prescribed legal meaning. I said again, I'm not a lawyer, but it's a case of, but then all of a sudden, when you start to look at legal obligations, because we focus too much on, oh my God, it's cyber and it's different and it's technical and da 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 da. Whereas if you look at it as information, you get, I mean, as I said, our oldest legal obligation that we actually have is 1879, it's Banker's Book Act. And that's long before we had all of this fancy computing. Because when you actually look at things and you map out things correctly, you can actually have provenance, you can actually have these things, and that actually impacts the way that officers should work. And it kind of takes away the technology and brings into it the behavior. And that's one of the real key things. If we start to think about information, as I said, we have a change agent. And that change agent is accelerated cultural programs that would have taken, in fact, to be fair, I think if it hadn't been for COVID, 10 years' time, people would have still been mass migration into London every single day. That is now has to change. But it's how organisations properly map up to it. And as I said, and you've only got to look at the DCMS study, when most of them haven't looked at their supply chain. And that's before they had cloud, before they had to actually go and react to it. And when and it's a lack of, I mean, and there's a kind of theme, lack of user awareness. Actually, more worryingly, 17% of organisations who do nothing after a security incident. So that actually causes an impact. So you've got to look at the way that organisations work, and until society actually says, well, okay, you got hacked, but you should have been able to do something. And that's where I say get back to those basics, actually build out from it, because then all of the things that we've talked here today, it means that you're talking about the behaviour and the corporate governance culture of the organisation, which should be easier because it's a soft thing, it's outcome driven.
Perfect. Thank you, Des. Just conscious of the time, and been through the questions now and everything. So as Sophie said, the upcoming events are on the screen. There's another one this year. That must be next week, isn't it? Blimey, the 15th of December. It is. Yeah, it's not even a week away. It's 6 days away. And this is the last masterclass of the year. The next one's on the 26th of January. But if any of those events are of interest, by all means, come and join us. Thank you so much, Des and Tate, for your time this evening. Both excellent presentations, very interesting. I think the new year, COVID aside, there's going to be a lot of interesting changes and things coming in next year. Maybe as a result of that, maybe others not so much. So yeah, thank you both for your time. Hope you've enjoyed it this evening. If you've attended this, and yeah, hope to see you on another event soon. Hopefully see you on in person at some point if you're in the Thames Valley area, maybe next year, towards the end of next year perhaps. So thank you very much for your time. I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Sophie, at all?
I just touch upon the fact that just on what you were saying with face-to-face events, hopefully, I mean, we are planning for our CIISec Live event next year as well, so something we can all look forward to. But we'll keep you all updated, and hopefully, as Craig said, we can see you all there face-to-face. But just reiterating what you said, Craig, thank you so much to Tate and Des, and to yourself as well for hosting. As always, you did an amazing job. And I look forward to seeing you all in the new year, if we don't see you on the AGP.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Take care, all. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.